You look at your savings, your salary, the price of goods. You assume a certain stability. It feels like a quiet foundation of modern life. But that stability is not a law of nature. It's a story we agree to believe. A promise made by the authority that issues the money. And history shows that when the state is squeezed, that promise is the first thing to be unilaterally rewritten. The cost is then transferred to you. Before any modern central bank, ancient Rome taught this lesson in its most brutal form. The empire was not conquered by barbarians at the gates alone. It was hollowed out from within, by its own money. The story of Rome's fall is a financial story. It went bankrupt long before its borders were overrun. For 2 centuries, this coin was the dollar of the ancient world, a trusted store of value, the bedrock of trade from Britain to the borders of Persia. It represented the power and the permanence of Rome itself, solid, reliable, as real as the stone and concrete of its aqueducts, until it wasn't. The state found itself with bills it could not pay, and an emperor's ambition required a quiet, insidious solution. The solution was hidden in plain sight, inside the very coins people trusted. They began to change the definition of money without changing its name. This is the story of how that promise was broken, step by step, and what it teaches us about the promises that hold our own world together. The tipping point for Rome was not a single catastrophe, but the slow, crushing weight of its own success. The empire ran on legions, aqueducts, and salaries, and the bill was constant. Then, in 64 AD, a specific crisis struck. The Great Fire of Rome devastated the capital. Rebuilding on a grand scale required a fortune, and the emperor, Nero, needed it fast. Simply raising taxes would have risked revolt. So Nero turned his attention to a quieter, more insidious source of revenue, the money itself. Under Nero's directive, the Roman mint made a small, secret change. For the first time, the silver content of the denarius was reduced, from around 95% to 90%. To the naked eye, the coin looked the same. It felt the same in the hand. It still bore the emperor's seal, the official stamp of its value. The promise was outwardly intact. But from the same amount of silver bullion, the state could now mint more coins. It was a hidden tax, paid by every person who held or accepted the currency without question. This was not the common crime of clipping, shaving silver from a coin's edge. This was different. This was state policy. The state itself had become the counterfeiter. A line had been crossed that could never truly be uncrossed. A precedent was set. The treasury had found a tool that was too powerful and too tempting to ever forget. Subsequent emperors, facing their own wars and vast ambitions, would return to this tool again and again. The small cut made by Nero became a deep, systemic wound. The state had now learned it could pay its debts not with real wealth, but with a form of money of its own invention. The question was no longer if they would do it again, but how far they would go. Nero's playbook created a temptation no successor could resist. But the true spiral began a century later, during the chaos of the 3rd century crisis, a 50-year storm of civil war and invasion. In this era of constant turmoil, an emperor's only claim to the throne was the loyalty of his army. And that loyalty had to be bought, again and again, with the only tool they had, the mint. Under the Severan dynasty, Military pay was doubled. To fund this, the denarius was aggressively debased. By the early 3rd century, its silver content had plunged from over 75% to around 50%. Then came a cynical innovation. Emperor Caracalla introduced a new coin, the Antoninianus. It was tariffed at 2 denarii, but it contained the silver of only 1.5, a state-mandated fraud. But the market is not a fool. Citizens immediately began hoarding the older, purer silver coins, which vanished from circulation. This is Gresham's law in action. Bad money drives out good. By the 260s AD, the denarius was effectively gone. Its replacement, the Antoninianus, had itself collapsed to less than 5% silver, a bronze core with a fragile silver-plated wash. The consequence was inevitable: runaway inflation. If the state minted twice as many coins with half the value, a merchant simply doubled his prices to compensate. Surviving records from Roman Egypt are explicit. A measure of wheat that cost 200 drachmae in the year 275 AD cost over 2 million less than 60 years later. A soldier's salary, once a handsome living, now barely fed his family. The very legionaries the state was debasing the currency to pay were being impoverished by the payment itself. The promise of the coin was shattered. The state had destroyed its own unit of account. So it turned to the tool desperate governments always use. It tried to command reality by force. In 284 AD, a general from Dalmatia, Diocletian, rose to power. He was a ruthless administrator, determined to forge order from the empire's monetary chaos. He reformed the military and expanded the bureaucracy. But he did not, or could not, reform the money. The debased coins were still needed to pay for his new, larger state. He saw spiraling prices riotously consuming the empire not as a symptom of bad money, but as a moral failing, a contagion of human greed. So in the year 301, he issued his solution, the Edict on Maximum Prices. It was one of the most comprehensive attempts at wage and price control in human history. The law set fixed prices for over 1,000 goods, from wheat and beer to Egyptian linen, and specified the wages for dozens of professions, from lawyers to sewer cleaners. The penalty for anyone caught selling a good for more than the legal price was death. The penalty for a buyer who knowingly paid more? Also death. The edict was a catastrophic failure. Merchants who could not sell at the mandated price without taking a loss simply stopped selling. Goods vanished from the open market. In its place, a thriving black market emerged almost overnight. Vital goods were still available, but only in secret, at much higher prices that reflected the real, debased currency. The law caused shortages and paralyzed what was left of commerce. Within a few years, the edict was unenforceable and largely abandoned, a monument to a fatal economic error. Price controls had failed. The money was broken. The state had one final, brutal lever of extraction to pull: direct confiscation under the quiet name of taxation. With its currency useless, the state switched to collecting taxes not in coins, but in goods. It was called the annona, a tax paid in kind, in grain, in oil, in labor. This system was horribly inefficient. Grain from Egypt had to be physically shipped to feed soldiers on the Rhine, creating immense logistical burdens and opportunities for rot and waste. To manage this, the state outsourced collection to publicani, private tax farmers who bid for the right to tax a province. Their profit was whatever they could extract above the government's quota. It was a system that legalized extortion. With little oversight, tax farmers squeezed provinces dry, and corruption became an organizing principle of the late Roman state. But the wealthy and well-connected found ways to escape. They bribed officials or bought legal exemptions, using their real gold, not debased coins, to consolidate their large estates, their latifundia. The entire tax burden, therefore, fell on those who could not bribe and could not flee: the small farmers and the city's middle class. They faced a simple choice: pay taxes they couldn't afford or lose everything. Crushed by taxes and debt, often owed to the same wealthy landowners who were evading taxes, they lost their land. They became coloni, tenant farmers, tied to the very fields they once owned. This arrangement was then formalized. Late imperial decrees bound these coloni and their children to the land they worked forever. They were not slaves, but they were no longer free. This was the birth of serfdom. The Roman middle class, the independent smallholders, the merchants, the artisans, was systematically hollowed out. Society polarized into a tiny class of the super-rich and a vast, impoverished peasantry. The empire was no longer a commonwealth. It was an extractive machine serving a tiny elite, a hollow shell. The barbarians didn't conquer a thriving civilization. They knocked on the door of an empty house. Rome fell. But the pattern that hollowed it out is a fundamental law of state finance. When the promises a state makes become larger than its ability to pay, it will not default openly. It redefines the money. The story of the denarius is not ancient history. It is a blueprint. The tools are more sophisticated now, not copper in the silver, but quantitative easing and central bank balance sheets. The principle is the same. Like an emperor who had to pay his legions, a modern state must fund its vast obligations. When tax revenue is not enough, the printing press, digital or physical, is the quietest solution. This is the invisible tax of the modern era. It doesn't appear on your tax forms. It appears as the slow erosion of your purchasing power, the nagging feeling that everything is getting more expensive. Rome teaches us to ask the right question when we read the news. The question is not if the national debt will be paid. It will be. The question is, with what? The true value of a currency is not the number printed on it. It is the trust held in the institution that issues it. When the money starts to lie, that trust decays, and things fall apart. The scales of justice are meant to be balanced, but history's true scale is between a state's promises and its assets. In the end, balance is always restored by devaluing the weights themselves. The state never defaults. It redefines the unit of payment. That is the final lesson from the denarius. This is not a call for panic. It is a call for clarity. Financial crises don't begin with a bang. They begin when a state quietly starts breaking the promise of its own money. Rome had Diocletian's edict on prices. We have had talk of transitory inflation. Which temporary measure of our time do you suspect will become permanent?